There are relationships that make perfect sense to everyone else, and then there are the ones that make people stop talking for just a second. Not because they know something you don't, but because they think they do. Sometimes the age difference is only visible in numbers. Other times it's visible in the way one person has already lived through storms the other hasn't even imagined yet. And somewhere between those two people, something very real can begin. Before we go any further, if these quiet conversations about love, psychology, and human behavior help you understand yourself a little better, subscribe and stay with me. There are some feelings most people never put into words, and that's exactly where we'll spend our time. Now, if you've ever loved someone much older or much younger, you've probably noticed something strange. The hardest part often isn't the relationship itself, it's the voice that slowly appears inside your own head. What if people are right? You weren't thinking about strangers when you first smiled at her. You weren't calculating birthdays while she laughed at something you said. You were simply present. Then one comment, one look, one joke from a friend. Suddenly, something that felt effortless becomes something you start defending, even when nobody is asking you to. And that's exhausting. Because love can survive many things, constant self-doubt is much harder. I've watched people slowly pull away from someone they genuinely cared about, not because the relationship was failing, but because they became afraid of what the relationship seemed to say about them. An older man begins wondering if everyone thinks he's chasing youth. A younger man quietly worries people believe he's immature or dependent. Neither fear appeared at the beginning. It arrived later, quietly, almost politely. That's how many doubts enter our lives, not with shouting, with whispers. What's fascinating is that these whispers often become louder than the actual relationship. A perfectly normal disagreement suddenly feels like proof the age gap is the problem. A misunderstanding that could happen between any couple suddenly feels different, more dangerous. You start collecting evidence, not of love, of risk. And once the mind begins searching for danger, it becomes surprisingly creative. It notices every awkward pause, every curious stare in a restaurant, every question that sounds just a little too interested. Little by little, you stop experiencing the relationship. You start observing it from the outside, almost like you're watching yourself through someone else's eyes. That's where something important begins to change. Because the biggest challenge in many age gap relationships isn't always the years between two people. Sometimes, it's the invisible audience they slowly invite into the relationship without realizing it. And once that audience finds a seat, it becomes much harder to hear each other. The invisible audience doesn't usually speak out loud. It lives in your imagination, and that's what makes it so convincing. You could be sitting across from her in a quiet cafe. She's telling you about her day. She's smiling in that relaxed way people only smile when they feel safe. Yet a different conversation is happening inside your head. Do people think she looks too young for me? Or maybe, do they assume I'm too inexperienced for her? Notice what just happened. You weren't listening anymore. You were managing perception. That's a very different kind of attention, and it slowly steals something precious from intimacy. Because intimacy isn't built when you're performing, it's built when you stop performing. I've seen this happen in ways so subtle that even the couple doesn't recognize it. A younger man hesitates before sharing a dream because he suddenly worries it sounds unrealistic compared to everything she's already accomplished, so he says less. An older man stops talking about his fears because he believes he's supposed to have everything figured out by now. So he says less too. Different reasons, same silence. From the outside, it looks like confidence. Inside, it's loneliness wearing a very convincing disguise. There's another moment that often slips past unnoticed. It happens after the excitement settles. The first few months are full of discovery. Every conversation feels new. Every difference feels interesting. She introduces you to music you've never heard. You show her places she never noticed. One of you remembers a world before smartphones. The other can't imagine it. At first, these differences feel charming. Then, one ordinary evening, one of you says something completely innocent. I don't really remember that. Or, I've already been through that stage. Such small sentences, almost forgettable. But depending on the emotional state of the person hearing them, they can land very differently. Not as information, as distance. Suddenly, the age gap feels larger than it did yesterday, even though nothing actually changed. This doesn't mean the relationship is weak. It means the human mind naturally searches for belonging. We all want to feel understood, not just loved, understood. There's a quiet difference between those two things. Someone can love you deeply and still struggle to understand the season of life you're in. And that's where many couples begin making a mistake. They try to erase their differences. They avoid certain conversations. They pretend the gap doesn't exist. Ironically, that often gives the gap even more power. Because unspoken realities rarely disappear. They simply wait. They wait until an argument, a stressful week, a family gathering. Then they return, carrying all the weight that silence has been collecting. But none of that is the darkest part. The darkest part appears when one person slowly begins changing who they are, not because the other person asked them to, but because they quietly become afraid that being themselves might make the distance between them impossible to ignore. And that's where love can begin losing something neither person ever intended to give away. The change almost never happens all at once. It's usually so gradual that you don't even notice it. One day you laugh a little less at the jokes you normally love. Another day you stop mentioning a hobby because it suddenly feels childish. Or maybe the opposite. You pretend to enjoy things that don't really interest you because you want to seem more mature, more experienced, more compatible. No one asked you to do it. That's what makes it so easy to miss. You convince yourself you're simply adapting. And to some extent, every healthy relationship involves adapting. We all make room for another person's habits, dreams, and routines. But there's a quiet line between growing together and slowly editing yourself. That line is easy to cross when you're afraid that who you really are might confirm everyone else's doubts. I've spoken with men who said something like this without realizing how much it revealed. I just don't want her to think she's dating a kid. Or, I don't want her to see me as an old man. Listen carefully to those sentences. Neither one is really about age. They're about identity. They're about the fear of becoming a stereotype instead of a person. Because once you start seeing yourself through labels, it's hard to show up naturally. You begin rehearsing conversations in your head before they happen. You wonder if a certain outfit makes you look too young or too old. You hesitate before sharing a memory because you're calculating what it says about your generation instead of simply telling your story. It's exhausting, not physically, emotionally. And emotional exhaustion has a strange effect. It makes even good relationships feel heavier than they really are. There's another quiet pattern that often appears. One person becomes the teacher, the other becomes the student. At first, it feels harmless. Maybe one has more life experience. Maybe the other brings fresh ideas and a different perspective. Both can be beautiful gifts. The problem begins when those roles stop changing. When one person always explains, always guides, always decides, and the other slowly stops questioning, stops contributing, stops trusting their own judgment. Healthy relationships usually allow both people to influence each other. Sometimes you're the one with the answer. Sometimes you're the one still figuring things out. That balance creates respect. Without it, affection can quietly turn into dependence or resentment. Neither happens overnight. They grow in the shadows of everyday moments. A decision made without asking. A concern brushed aside with, "You'll understand when you're older." Or, "I've already lived through this." Maybe it's said with kindness. Maybe it isn't. But if those moments keep repeating, something inside the other person begins to shrink. Not because they're weak, because everyone wants to feel that their voice carries equal weight. And there's one question that many couples avoid because it feels too uncomfortable to ask. Not, do we love each other? But, are we still meeting as equals? Or have we quietly started meeting as roles? The answer to that question can change everything that happens next. There comes a moment in some relationships that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No slammed doors, no shouting, no final goodbye. Just two people sitting in the same room, feeling strangely alone. One of them is talking, the other is listening. At least, that's what it looks like. But underneath the conversation, something else is happening. One is thinking, she doesn't really understand where I am in life. The other is thinking, I don't know how to help him without sounding like I'm lecturing. Neither thought is cruel, both are lonely. And loneliness inside a relationship feels different from loneliness by yourself. When you're alone, you know what's missing. When you're lonely beside someone you love, you start questioning things you were once certain about. Was the connection ever as deep as it felt? Did we only fall in love with the version of each other we needed at that time? Those questions can be frightening because they don't have quick answers. Yet they're worth asking, not to create doubt, but to create honesty. I've noticed that the strongest age gap couples rarely pretend they're in exactly the same season of life. They don't force perfect symmetry. Instead, they become curious about each other's reality. An older partner might say, "Help me understand what this stage of your life feels like." A younger partner might ask, "Tell me what you've learned that I can't see yet." Do you hear the difference? Neither person is trying to win, they're trying to understand. Understanding has a quiet way of dissolving tension that arguments never can. Still, there is one trap that catches many couples because it feels like love. It's sacrifice. Now, sacrifice isn't always unhealthy. Every lasting relationship asks both people to give something: time, patience, comfort, sometimes pride. But there's another kind of sacrifice that's much harder to recognize. It's when one person quietly postpones becoming themselves. A younger man delays pursuing opportunities because he worries the relationship can't survive the change. An older man begins acting younger than he feels because he's afraid authenticity will make him seem less desirable. Neither decision happens in one afternoon. They grow through dozens of tiny compromises that seem harmless on their own. Until one morning, months or even years later, someone looks in the mirror and has a difficult thought. When did I stop sounding like myself? That question doesn't necessarily mean the relationship has failed. Sometimes it's the beginning of saving it. Because real intimacy isn't asking someone to become smaller so they fit more comfortably beside you. It's making enough space that both people can keep growing. And that's where the conversation becomes even more uncomfortable. Because the greatest threat to many age gap relationships isn't judgment from strangers. It's what happens when growth starts pulling two good people in different directions, and neither of them knows whether holding on is an act of love or an act of fear. Maybe that's the hardest truth of all. Not every relationship ends because love disappears. Sometimes love remains, quietly, while two lives begin asking for different things. That's painful to admit because we like simple endings. We want someone to be the villain. We want one clear mistake we can point to and say, "That's when everything fell apart." Real life rarely gives us that. More often, two people are simply changing. The younger partner is discovering who he wants to become. The older partner is protecting the life she has spent years building. Neither desire is wrong. They just don't always move at the same speed. And speed matters more than most people realize. When one person is racing toward new beginnings while the other is searching for stability, love can start feeling like a negotiation instead of a refuge. But don't misunderstand this. An age gap doesn't automatically create that problem. I've met couples separated by decades who spoke to each other with remarkable respect. I've also seen couples born only months apart who never truly understood one another. The calendar isn't the deciding factor. The emotional space between two people is. Can you tell each other the truth without fear? Can you disagree without trying to shrink the other person? Can you celebrate each other's growth, even when that growth feels unfamiliar? Those questions often reveal far more than birthdays ever could. There's one final observation I've carried with me after years of watching relationships unfold. The healthiest couples don't spend much time trying to prove everyone else wrong. They spend their energy proving each other safe. Safe to be honest. Safe to admit insecurity. Safe to say, I'm afraid. Safe to confess, I don't know what comes next. Because certainty is attractive for a moment, safety is what keeps people close for years. If you're in an age gap relationship, don't ask yourself whether strangers approve. Strangers don't have to live your life. Instead, ask something quieter. When you're with this person, do you feel more like yourself or less? Do you leave conversations feeling understood or carefully edited? Does the relationship invite honesty or constant performance? The answers may not arrive tonight. Some questions deserve time. But if you listen carefully, not to the noise outside, but to the calmer voice you've been ignoring, you'll often discover that it already knows the difference between fear and love. And perhaps that's the dark side no one talks about. It isn't the years between two people. It's the silent ways fear can borrow those years and convince two hearts to doubt something that deserved a deeper conversation instead of a quicker judgment.